I'm Andrea Cohen, leader of member relations at Vermont Electric Cooperative, and we'd like to welcome you to the next webinar in our Innovation webinar series. Today's topic is power supply and how VEC is navigating for the future. It is certainly an interesting and challenging time in the power supply space. Welcome and thank you for joining. Our main presenter today is Dan Potter, VEC's power planning analyst. But first, I'm going to kick things off with some information from our annual member survey with some interesting feedback related to the topic from our member owners. So I'll go first. Dan will then dive in deep to share how the power supply team does their work, and then we will have time to answer questions. First, some logistics. This webinar is being recorded, and all registrants will be sent a link to the recording after the webinar. The link will also be posted on our website, so feel free to share that with other people who you think might be interested. Guests are muted and the chat is not active, but please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A option, and we will then do our best to address them during the Q&A session. So I will share a few slides and then turn it over to Dan. Okay. So VEC has an annual member survey, and we do ask some questions about power supply priorities. And the big overall theme, and you'll see just a few slides on this topic, is that low-cost energy continues to be more important than anything else to our members, more important than renewability, more important than carbon-free energy when we force them to prioritize their priorities. Renewable energy continues to be more important than carbon-free energy. And when we ask them to differentiate about in-state versus out-of-state resources, there's not that much of a difference there. This is the detail on that question, and you can see over the last few years, things have been very consistent with low-cost energy being the highest priority, followed by renewability, and then carbon-free. When we ask members again about how they're feeling about VEC as it comes to the issue about rates, you can see that this is over the last 10 years or so. You can see we had a nice increase in favorability, that folks thought we were charging reasonable rates. But over the last 5 years, you can see that that perspective has kind of gone on a downward slope. This is post-COVID. This is also during the time when we've had to have a series of rate increases. And the reason we're sharing this slide is to just say that cost is an important priority, and it does factor into our power supply decisions. This is the last slide before I turn it over to Dan, but a really interesting slide. Again, over the last 10 years, we've asked our members on the member survey to tell us how they felt about various power supply resources, everything from hydro, solar, wind, biomass, natural gas, and nuclear. And one of the interesting trends over these past 10 years you could see is that the high-low, the difference between the most favored resource and the least favored resource, which was either hydro or solar compared to, say, nuclear, that gap is narrowing over time, that the difference between the most favored and the least favored is getting narrower. You can see that hydro and solar are always the more preferred priorities. You can see that if 2 years ago that those lines actually crossed, and we see that hydropower is actually more favored over solar these days. You can see the hydro is relatively flat, but the solar over the past 5 years has actually been declining in favorability. Wind has been kind of in the middle of the pack, and there's been a little bit of a downward report on that. Biomass has declined considerably, is bouncing back up. The interesting thing is also nuclear, which is actually favored more now than it was 10 years ago, and kind of catching up with some of the other resources. The reason we're sharing this information and that we gather this information is it does factor into our power supply decisions at VEC. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Dan, who's going to really deep dive into some of his work. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Andrea. So as Andrea said, my name is Dan Potter. I'm a power planning analyst here at VEC, and I'm going to talk about how we think about power supply at VEC. And I have to say my accommodations today are slightly more comfortable than one of the last times I gave this presentation. This was me at one of the previous annual meetings. My colleagues and I decided to test whether a full-grown adult could fit into the frunk of a Ford F-150. Spoiler alert, it works. I was able to fit in and completely close it. And there's for those who ever find themselves in this situation, there's a glowing frunk release button on the inside that you can hit if you need to get out of there. So turning to power supply, I'm going to talk about how we think about power supply at VEC. I'll provide a quick overview of VEC's 2024 power mix. We'll talk about how we achieved a carbon-free power portfolio on an annual basis for 2024. We'll take a little look at future power resources, and then I'll talk through the considerations that we go through when we're talking about adding resources to the power mix at VEC. When we're talking about any power supply decisions, these three items in bold at the top of this slide, these are the guiding principles that we use. So the first one is affordability. As Andrea talked about, that continues to be the item of most importance to our members with respect to power supply. Is our power affordable? Two other guiding principles are diversity and synergy. And what I mean by diversity is, do we have a diverse set of resources within our power supply portfolio so that we don't have all of our risks set into one basket? And then synergy, do the resources both within our power supply portfolio and those that we're considering adding to our power supply portfolio, how do they mesh together with the other resources in the power portfolio, or how do they mesh together against the load that our members are putting onto the system when they're using power? In addition to those three guiding principles, our board of directors has also passed a resolution to be 100% carbon-free on an annual basis starting in 2023, and then 100% renewable starting in 2030. So that always comes into mind when we're making power supply decisions. How do these resources that we're talking about help us meet the guiding principles and then these board of director resolutions? In addition to those guiding principles and board resolutions, we also have Vermont's Renewable Energy Standard. This is a law that governs the percentage of power that must be from renewable resources within a utility's power portfolio. On this slide, we have a couple of the tiers that we interact with most. So tier 1 is the overall renewability. Again, that requirement is to be 100% renewable by 2030. That is a state law. And then tier 2, this is for distributed resources, newer distributed resources. Those are for resources that are in state, within the state of Vermont. They're small, less than 5 megawatts, and they have to have come online after January 1st of 2010. This percentage currently sits in the 6 to 7% ballpark, but ramps up to about 20% of our power portfolio by 2032. And then tier 4, this tier is not actually active within our power portfolio yet, but it does inform decisions we make when we're looking at 5, 10, or 15 years. This is a new regional tier. So this tier is for power resources connected to the ISO New England system or capable of delivery into the ISO New England system. And this tier starts in 2030 at 5% of our power portfolio and increases to 10% by 2035. And again, these are for newer resources that have come online after January 1st of 2010. To level set a little bit with respect to our power portfolio, we do not own any generation facilities. So what I'm talking about really today is managing a portfolio of contracts to help us meet our members' needs for power. And in 2025, our power supply budget was about 38 million. And in 24, we purchased about 500,000 megawatt hours of energy. That's just to give a quick sense of scale. So turning to the sources of power we have at VEC, this pie chart shows the sources of power from a contractual basis that we had for 2024. You see we had about 8% solar, 4% from small hydro, that's less than 5 megawatts. We had 45% from large hydro, and the vast majority of that 45% comes from Hydro Quebec. We do have some NYPA power in there, though. That's the New York Power Authority, so the Niagara and St. Lawrence dams. We had 2% biomass, 18% from wind power, 14% from nuclear, and then we did buy just shy of 10%, 9% of our power on the open market. In 2024, we achieved a carbon-free power portfolio on an annual basis. So after all those sources of power I was just talking about, we had a gap of megawatt hours that did not have carbon-free attributes associated with them of just shy of 200,000 megawatt hours. We were able to go to the market and purchase renewable attributes or carbon-free attributes to cover that gap in 2024. This was an estimated cost of just shy of about $1 million. So after the attribute trading I was just talking about, after we completed that for 2024, this pie chart shows all of the megawatt hours for VEC's load for 2024 and how we covered that. So you can see large hydro jumped up to 77%. So we purchased a large number of renewable energy credits associated with hydro facilities. The reason for that is that those were the cheapest by far resource that we could to cover a carbon-free position. We still kept about 6% solar attributes within our portfolio. Those were largely to meet tier 2 of the res that I talked about earlier. And then we have about 17% of that being covered by nuclear emissions-free certificates. Turning to future power resources, this chart is a little busy, but it shows some important things. So we'll start with the dotted black line. That is a line that is a projection of our members' load. So our annual load, how much energy we think you all will use in a given year. The bar charts show the resources that we have in our power portfolio. Those in green on the left are resources that we have in our power portfolio that can help us to meet a carbon-free requirement. And that's why it only goes through 2029, because our commitment to be 100% renewable starts in 2030. And so those bar charts in blue starting in 2030 are the renewable resources that we currently have in our power portfolio. And so what this shows is that we're pretty good from a carbon-free perspective. We have a slight gap starting in 2028, 2029 that we'll need to cover. But starting in 2030, we need to start filling the gap between the projection of load and the resources we have in our power portfolio. And that's where we spend a lot of our time thinking about and time and energy. It's this gap between the line in this chart and the bars on the bottom. And it's what we're here talking about today. So when we're thinking about filling that gap, we can talk about a variety of different resources. For carbon-free, that's really any of these, but it also includes nuclear. That's the main difference between renewable and carbon-free. And then for 2030 and beyond, we really want to focus on the renewable resources. So that is solar, hydro, biomass, and onshore and offshore wind. And I alluded to this earlier, but when resources produce power is very important, and because we need to line that up with when our members are using power. And so this chart shows by resource type, by technology type, the percent of time that these resources generate power. The top line in orange is a nuclear facility. You can see that hovers at about 100% all months of the year. And the x-axis on the bottom is months of the year. Should point that out. So nuclear facilities usually produce at their full capacity year-round. The dip in April here is important to note, though, because once every 18 months, nuclear facilities need to power down for maintenance and refueling. So that's something we think about and plan for in the power portfolio. The next line down is biomass. Again, those facilities usually produce near their total capacity. It hovers around 90% in all months of the year. Moving down the chart to offshore and onshore wind, those are the gray lines. Offshore is the dark gray line, and onshore is the dotted gray line. You can see those facilities produce more power in the winter months and less power in the summer months. And they have a complementary shape to the yellow hydro line, the yellow solar line, excuse me. Solar, as you can imagine, produces less power in the winter months and more power in the summer months. And then the blue line is a hydro facility. Again, you got a little bit more in the winter months. You have a jump up in April when water's really flowing. It bumps down a little bit in July and August as things start to dry out. But the main takeaway I want to leave you with from this chart is that, all technology types are not created equal. And when we're thinking about adding resources to our power portfolio, we really need to figure out how these new resources, how their production lines up against when our members are using power and against the production shape of the existing resources within our power portfolio. So we can try to line those up as much as possible. So to wrap things up a little bit here, when we are adding resources to the portfolio, we go through a process to do that. First, we do a thorough analysis about those things I just mentioned. What does our members' load shape look like in aggregate? When do we need power? And what type of power we may want to add with respect to technology types. We then go through an RFP process. Usually we'll put an RFP out to a number of different suppliers or post it publicly and outline those things I just talked about. Here's the shape of power we're looking to purchase, and here are the requirements that we need to meet with these power purchases. And then we will execute if we get a respondent that is that makes sense from affordability and price perspective and meets all of those things I just outlined, the shape and the technology types, will execute a power purchase agreement with that respondent. The criteria that we use to evaluate the RFP respondents are, again, cost effectiveness. That's always the first thing we look at because to Andrea's point earlier about our members' desires, affordability is number one. But then we'll look at renewability. Does it help us meet our board commitments to be renewable and or the renewable energy standard? And then lastly, the production shape and how those resources interact with our existing resources. And then to close with a little bit of humor. So what do wind turbines think of renewable energy? They're big fans. And that's it. I think now we can turn it over to questions.
Oh, okay. Well, that is a great joke. Thank you for that moment. So we've got a bunch of questions coming in. So we're gonna do our best to get to every one of them. And if not, we can follow up. We have your names in the chat and on the registration. So let me start, Dan, with battery storage. A few different questions around that. What is the role of battery storage? Maybe you want to take your stop sharing.
Thank you. Yes.
See you bigger. So the role of battery storage, does it help us use more renewable energy, and how are we, approaching that?
So VEC has 2 utility scale batteries on our system currently. We have entitlement to a 1 megawatt, 4 megawatt hours of a battery in Heinsberg, as well as a battery in North Troy that is 3 megawatt, 12 megawatt hours that we share with Green Mountain Power. And currently we're using those batteries primarily and almost exclusively for peak shaving or in the frequency regulation market at ISO New England. And that is because that is by far the most valuable way to use those batteries and the most lucrative way to use those batteries. With respect to your question about does it help us use more renewable energy, The North Troy battery was actually installed with a grant from the Department of Energy to study how we can use that battery to soak up wind energy that otherwise may have been curtailed or shut off from ISO New England. And so that's one of those things we're just kind of dipping our toe into with this pilot study with respect to this battery. It's also important to note that batteries right now can move energy like day to day, but moving energy, let's say from the middle of summer to the middle of winter, is not really a viable option right now with the current battery technologies.
And on the battery, on the residential scale, there was a question in the chat from Peter about, during an event, can people, it's related to whether you can access, like, can people override so that they can access their battery during an event, even if we're managing that, if they opt in to have that managed. So during an event, we do give people the ability to override if they need to, correct?
Not with respect to home batteries. That is not a functionality that is supported through the software that we're using to do that right now. It's possible that that comes back in the future, but not currently.
Okay, that's good. So how we're addressing that problem is looking at other software opportunities that continue to evolve. Like that world's in a lot of development, a lot of innovation happening right now.
That is very true. There's a lot of change going on in that nascent industry. I will note that by far most participants in our program are Tesla Powerwall owners, and the Power Hub software and the Powerwall software both do a pretty good job of, I think the main reason folks would want to opt out of an event like that is that they're worried about an outage coming along. Let's say there's a major storm coming through. So a couple of things that I think can put folks at ease there. One, the Tesla software will actually, if they see weather coming through, they will override any commands sent to those batteries by us. But we also, if we see a storm coming through that has the potential to cause widespread system outages, we will cancel dispatch events ahead of that, because we recognize that backup power is the primary use case for these device types for our members.
Got it. All right, thanks. Natural gas and VEC members, a question came in the chat and I just texted to someone else on our team. I didn't know if you know this off the top of your head, but the question was, how many VEC members are able to access natural gas? And I don't know the answer to that, except for you have to be living like Chittenden and Franklin and at Addison, which we don't really have a lot, except for Starksboro and Addison County. So it's not a large percentage of our members. I don't really know the exact number. Do you have more on that?
I don't either. Again, it's a low number.
Yeah, pretty low. David in the Q&A asked about, we mentioned that we don't own generation assets, and he asked about Lowell, and we do have a small piece of Lowell wind farm. So thank you for that. Right, we have about 12% of Lowell, I believe.
Yeah, it's a 63 megawatt facility. We contract for 8 megawatts of that facility. Okay. And we are, GMP passes along the any O&M related costs on that basis share percentage.
Right. So we do own some wind generation. So thanks for that question, David. Is the VEC board considering changing our renewable goal to a carbon-free goal so that nuclear can be included? We actually have both goals. So we do have a carbon-free goal that we're already hitting. So we're kind of doing both of those things, right? At the same time, looking to hit both of those goals. And the question often comes up, what's the difference? And it is the nuclear, right, Dan, when you're doing the calculating.
Yeah, the main difference between the renewable goal and the carbon-free goal is that we can use nuclear attributes to meet the carbon-free portion.
Right. Let's see, I'm scrolling through comments live, so it's taking me a second here. So wind, since we started on wind, do you think we'll ever see a new wind project in Vermont? And is small wind a thing? We've been hearing more about small wind.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty unlikely that we'll see a new large-scale wind facility in Vermont. I mean, I think as most folks know, the political environment for such a thing right now is not favorable. With respect to small backyard wind, that's, we get a handful of those here and there. You can net meter them like you can a solar facility, but they are not prevalent at all in our systems.
Right. We just went out to procure more wind. We're interested in more wind. Correct? We procured some from New York State, if I'm remembering well. The nuclear, where does the nuclear come from? Is it open market or is there a specific source?
That's a good question. We contract specifically for output of the Seabrook facility, which is in southern New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. About solar, people are asking about our community solar because, and I could kind of take this one. We do have a bunch of community solar sites. We don't own those actually. We have PPAs to procure that power and we use that for our community solar program, but we are not owners of those sites. And that's a great program. And if you're interested in learning more, go to our website and look under our programs. You'll see VEC Co-op Community Solar. It's a great option for people that don't have a suitable site or just are not interested in hosting solar on their own house. It's an opportunity. It's kind of like a farm CSA where you kind of pre-buy the energy, you pay up front, and then you get a set monthly bill credit every month for the term, which most people choose a 10-year term. Something to look into as another way to go solar and support local renewable energy. Dan, the cost of nuclear compared to the cost of biomass.
They're not too far apart, really. I would say, and all I have to go on is we did do an RFP for power in the last 12 months, and we did have a biomass respondent within that RFP. That particular biomass facility had a fairly high response into our RFP. So nuclear, I would, at least with respect to our existing contract, is more favorable as compared to that response to the RFP. And so that's the best information I can go on right now. I would say right now biomass is going to be higher. They are both, more or less baseload sources of power, which is something, baseload sources of carbon-free power, which is something that is really attractive.
We're getting lots of questions, which is great. Obviously, we picked an interesting topic. We find it interesting, so it's glad to see that other people do too. It's really important. I mean, it's important to our future, our reliability, our environmental impact, our cost. I mean, it's a big part of our operation, and Dan and his team, really spend a lot of time. So, and they don't necessarily get out talking about it. So it's great to get the questions and the feedback. So spot market, what kind of power is that we end up picking up on the spot market?
Yeah, good question. The spot market is the real-time energy market administered by ISO New England. And so it's earlier when I showed you those two pie charts, our sources of power from a contractual basis, and then our sources of power after we had settled all of the renewable energy attributes for the year. The way I think about spot market power is after all those certificates have been claimed by respondents at the end of the year, spot market power is whatever is not claimed. Usually natural gas facilities, right? Because everyone's claiming the nuclear and hydro and solar and wind attributes. That's from an annual settlement perspective. On a real-time basis, it's whatever the marginal unit is. Again, it's often natural gas.
Great. Let me scan a little bit. You got a nice comment. VEC, love your transparency and candor. You always do a great job. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you for that.
We try. The 2030 renewables goal, one commenter, how attainable is that goal? And will you have to, what has to happen for you to meet that goal?
Yeah, it's important to recognize that that is an annual goal and not a monthly or hourly goal. And so, yeah, I think it's fairly and easily attainable on an annual basis. It's at the cost of doing so is the biggest factor when we're looking at that, right? In getting contracts that are renewable and cost effective is what we are most focused on. When the region starts to move to a sub-annual accounting process, monthly or hourly, that is when achieving full renewability becomes much more difficult. Because it's great for Vermont to say we can achieve this on an annual basis. When everybody starts to do it on an annual basis, it means you have to move to a sub-annual accounting level.
Interesting. Another question about peak shaving and how a utility positions relative to other utilities. So in a sense, it's a competitive situation. Can you maybe just start with how that all plays out financially? Like who sets the peak? How often is it set? How do we figure out our part of that?
Yeah, sure. So the peak shaving we're doing is really focused on two areas of costs. It's our capacity related costs and our regional transmission or regional network service related costs. The capacity portion is based on the 1 hour that the ISO New England system peaks each year. That is usually, ISO New England is a summer peaker, so that is usually June, July, August, occasionally early September if we get a big heat wave. And so our costs are based on our share of load in that 1 hour. And so we are trying to predict when the ISO New England system will peak each year and lower our load in that hour. That's why we're using peak shaving resources like the utility scale batteries to put energy back on the grid during when we think that hour will be, and asking EV chargers to shut off during those hours as well. On the transmission side, the structure is very similar. It's just that we are shooting at the 1 hour that the Vermont system peaks each month. So it's all year round. As you can imagine, January is cold driven, August is a heat driven peak. And our transmission related costs are again assessed based on our contribution, our amount of load that we have on the Vermont system in the 1 hour that it peaks for the month. And the same things applies. We don't know when that peak will be in any given month until after the month has been settled. So that's why we're calling, 4, 5, 6, 7 events during the course of a month, because we don't know, we're not clairvoyant. We don't know which of those is actually going to be the peak until you have all the data for the entire month.
So it is a closed system, though, in a sense, there's going to be the better job we're doing, maybe that has a negative impact on us, another utility, right? Because their share will be relatively bigger. It's an interest. People find it an interesting and maybe not even perfect system, in terms of how that is, the cost accounting of that.
True. If we are lowering our load at a better rate than other utilities in Vermont or New England, we are essentially competing with them for the share of these costs.
Right. Which everybody then is working hard to do a good job at it. So that's good. But, it is make it less cooperation maybe on certain, it doesn't lend itself. Which another question we had has to do with efficiency and how does that play into all this? Of course, if we're not needing the power, then that helps with reducing load and share and all that. And of course, Efficiency Vermont is a huge partner in that. But we also do our own beat the peak stuff, and we ask people to reduce power at, when we know we're having a peak event. Any other just comments on efficiency measures and how we work that in?
You know, probably the biggest way we utilize and think about the efficiency information and data that's coming through is in that load forecast. So that load forecast I was showing the line.
Right.
What we're doing there is we're taking historical loads and then we're looking at efficiency adoptions, net metering adoptions, and then heat pump and EVs. Those are the biggest drivers of the shape of that line over time. And so efficiency is baked into that forecast, and it is lowering. It does have an impact of lowering that line over time, and therefore lowering the amount of purchases that we need to make on an annual basis.
And, the load forecast, we've been talking a lot about, not to go into, federal politics and thing, but there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of the incentives for, say, EVs and, heat pumps are, in flux and changing. And we've been asked this question daily, like, what does it all mean? And, the short answer is we're still trying to figure it out. But I think, it's a little, very variable and very volatile right now for people like you who are trying to do these load forecasts. And we do also in our member survey, which will be published soon on the website, we ask about future load. Like, do you see yourself that you're going to be driving an EV? Do you think you're going to be getting a heat pump? And, we've been interested to see that things are kind of, tracking with like less incentives means less likelihood that people are transitioning to, beneficial electrification. So how are you doing your job with load forecasting in the midst of all this volatility? Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, it is difficult. There are a lot of moving parts. There's a lot in flux, just like you said. We are just kind of doing the best we can at this point in time with the information we have now. We do those load forecasts once every 3 years. And so usually the decision timeline we're making, in the next handful of years is a little more certain than if you're trying to make a decision 20, 30 years out, right? And
Right.
so that gives me a little bit of comfort is that it's much more accurate in the 3 to 5 year window than it is going to be in the 10, 15, 20 year window. But that's all we can do is use the information we
Right.
have today. And that's why we reiterate on these and do them every few years.
Right. So somebody asked an interesting question. Are you using AI to improve your planning and your power distribution? Are you finding you're using AI in your work yet? It's
A
okay if you
little
say
bit, but
no.
yeah, no, I do a little bit, but not, I would say not deeply with respect to the analysis that I was talking about when we're talking about looking at load and generation and how that all fits together.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all thinking about how AI works into our work and also from our, energy usage, right? So, that's going to be a driver going forward. So interesting times we're in. We are kind of getting there. We talked about federal stuff a little bit. People ask a lot about tariffs again. Another thing that's one thing we've been trying to let members know, if something did come our way in terms of a big cost increase, we don't just like integrate that into our bills next week. Anything we do with new cost drivers, whether it's federal tariffs or any other cost driver, works into our rate cases, and we go through a whole process, and there's a lot of oversight and scrutiny and public process. So, rate changes don't happen tomorrow. So if there was upward pressure, that will play out, but it won't be tomorrow. It'll be, starting up next summer, like when we're putting our next rate case together. Anything else on that, Dan? Because we do get asked that a lot.
The only thing I'll add there is that we do have a large chunk of our power come from Hydro-Quebec. And so the question we were all struggling with earlier this year was, will there be tariffs assessed on that electricity flowing from HQ? And that is not something that is being collected currently. And again, if it were, we would go through the entire process that Andrea just described.
Yeah. Great. Well, I'd say, Dan, anything else that we didn't get to that's important to share? something coming up or emerging that we didn't talk about? I love the chart with the capacity, because to your earlier point about like people are like, well, I have solar panels. Doesn't that help you? Well, on a cold winter night, that's not helping us so much, and the batteries will only get us so far. So we still need, like when you're doing procurement, the diversity of the portfolio and the complementary resources seems to be an important thing there.
Extremely important. And if you're to leave this webinar with one message, that's it, right? It's when power is produced is extremely important as we compare it to when power is needed and being consumed.
Well, great. And, this isn't the end of the conversation. As member owners, one of the things you can do is always reach out to us. We're very available and responsive. We try to be, given the competing time, but we will get back to you and we'll take a look at these questions. If we didn't get to them, I apologize, but we will, if you want to throw your email in the chat with another question, that even if you didn't get to ask yet. But I'd say, Dan, on that, that concludes today's webinar. So thank you, everyone, for taking time and your interest in this topic. And I think when you leave here, you're going to get prompted to fill out a survey when you exit the webinar. So feel free. We're interested in what other topics you might want to learn more about. Our next webinar will probably be after the summer. And also, this summer, our team is out and about at various community events. So look for those announcements. We might be at a farmer's market or energy fair near you sometime soon. And we look forward to hearing more from you and seeing some of you soon. So thank you so much for your time.